The Ethereum merge to proof of stake in September 2020 has been an exciting event in the crypto ecosystem, but it's also revealed a number of deep misunderstandings about proof of work and the energy industry. So, here are my 5 reasons why proof of work mining is worth the energy. And this video will clear up a number of those misunderstandings about Bitcoin's energy consumption. First, a couple of foundations that I think that we can all agree upon. Energy is a scarce resource, and conservation thereof is a really good principle. At its most basic, each individual only has so many hours in the day, days in the week, weeks in the month, months in the year, and we're only on this planet for so long. The earth itself is, of course, scarce in its resources, trees and fresh air and water, and we need to take care of these things, undoubtedly. The second foundational point here is that we value our energy and our activities very differently. Some people care about playing games. Other people care about watching sport. Some people care about doing exercise. Some people care about concerts. And other people care about Britney Spears concerts. And there's lots of different things that we each value as individuals. But I think what's interesting is while we might judge people for what they do, we might judge people for going to a Britney Spears concert, we don't generally tell people that is a waste of their energy, that people shouldn't be expending their energy in that way. So that leaves me with a little question here, is why is it that we judge the energy used in proof of work blockchain mining or Bitcoin mining? And I'll come back to that in a moment. So here are my 5 reasons that I promised. First of all, these energy consumption estimates of proof of work mining, they are actually hugely variable, and a lot of them are hugely inaccurate. In fact, all of them are inaccurate because it's impossible to predict. I encourage you to watch a longer video about proof of work because I'm going to make this very quick. But proof of work is Bitcoin's consensus mechanism. Miners compete against each other to put blocks of transactions onto the blockchain. They use specialized equipment and energy or electricity, and they get paid in Bitcoin. And this process is essentially, Bitcoin's security and issuance model. We do not know how much energy is actually being used by Bitcoin miners. What we know is the hash rate of those miners, how much computer processing power miners are allocating towards the network. And what people can do is they can take that hash rate and estimate the energy consumption. Now, it's important to note, of course, that is an estimate, and the estimate is reliant on other estimations. You have to estimate what type of equipment miners are using, whether it's old or whether it's new. The newer it is, the more efficient it is. And the second component being you have to estimate what price those miners are paying for their electricity. So let me tell you a little bit more about Bitcoin miners. They are very profit maximizing industry because their inputs are so simple. It's just the equipment and the electricity. So they hunt out the cheapest electricity in the world. And there's actually a lot of what we call stranded energy in the world, or actually free electricity. While energy is a scarce resource, what's interesting about the energy industry is we actually waste a lot of energy. This relationship between production and consumption is not as simple as it might seem on the surface. So, energy is not very easy to transport, and it's not very easy to store. And at the other side of the equation, consumers don't demand a consistent amount of energy. Like we demand more electricity at certain times of day, certain times of the week, certain times of the month, certain times of the year. And so for a grid to be stable, it's not always easy to match up supply and demand. And what ends up happening is that the power producers will, of course, try to produce as much as the consumption would look like at the peak point when we're consuming as much as humanly possible. But then, as you can imagine, all the rest of the time when we aren't at peak demand, that means that there's often more energy than is required, or surplus. And a lot of the time, that is stranded electricity that just gets, pumped into the ground. So Bitcoin miners can actually hunt this out. And what's particularly interesting about Bitcoin miners is they don't care where they are located. They can go right to the source, which allows them to make use of this stranded electricity. And that's why these estimates are hugely variable and, as I said, inaccurate, because these people who are conducting their estimates have no idea actually what these Bitcoin miners are paying for electricity, and increasingly over time, it is gravitating towards stranded energy. So because Bitcoin miners are both transportable and also they can be turned off very easily, unlike other industries where you would have a negative impact on a manufacturer, as example, if you just turn them off. Bitcoin miners, while they would like to be on all the time, they can be turned off. And this has very positive implications for the energy industry itself. One is the impact on renewable producers. So renewable producers run into this challenge. They can be particularly intermittent in their production. For instance, if you think about, wind or solar, that's quite intermittent. And then the other challenge that renewable producers often face by is having quite large fixed costs. So even hydroelectric dams, as an example, very expensive in order to create. And if you don't have enough consistent demand, it means that it's infeasible to create that renewable energy. And so Bitcoin miners can actually provide a tool to renewable energy producers, allowing them to have this consistent base load demand, as we call it, which can make the whole venture more viable than it would have been otherwise. And then the other positive component is that because the miners can be switched off, that can enhance grid stability. And there's quite a bit of research on both of these components in Texas, but we've seen examples of this all the way around the world, where Bitcoin miners are actually having a positive impact on the energy industry outside of the actual crypto world. So returning to the question that I posed earlier, why is it that we judge the energy usage by proof of work blockchain miners or Bitcoin miners, whereas we don't judge the energy usage by banks, as an example? And banks have stores on every street corner, and they send executives all the way around the world and every day. Why aren't we judging these other industries for the energy that they consume? And I asked this question recently at a meetup where I gave this talk, and two good answers were provided. First of all, Bitcoin's transparency of data allows the estimate to be made. Although the estimate is inaccurate, it can be made because we have the transparent data of the number of hashes that are allocated towards the network. And that's unlike any other industry. So, Bitcoin's transparency is almost kind of working against it in this instance. And the second component is that there are lots of people who don't like Bitcoin. And if you don't like Bitcoin, or you don't understand its value, then clearly you're going to think the usage of energy is a waste. So if you're speaking to anybody and they're critiquing Bitcoin's energy consumption, you need to just check whether they actually understand the underlying value of this technology. Because if they don't, then you can clearly discount anything that they are saying about the energy consumption. And while there are clearly a bunch of people both in the crypto markets as well as outside of crypto who don't like Bitcoin and clearly are going to think that the energy is a waste of time, there are plenty of people who have the opposite opinion. So, what about people in Afghanistan, women in Afghanistan who've been able to get bank accounts through Bitcoin in order to conduct work on the internet and conduct their lives, whereas previously, just being women in a place like Afghanistan, they wouldn't have been able to access bank accounts. That's a powerful use case of this technology. Or people in Venezuela who are suffering from hyperinflation, who've been able to use Bitcoin's store of value qualities in order to feed their family. Or perhaps people in Belarus or Nigeria who are political dissidents and have been able to use Bitcoin for crowd funding. And there's a link up above where I've got a longer video where I go into more detail on these use cases of Bitcoin. But if you speak to these people, I'm sure that they would think that the energy is very worthwhile. So while I do critique the energy estimates of Bitcoin, I don't deny that there is a lot of energy used. But as I said at the start, different people will see energy expenditure on different goods and services differently. And from my opinion, and from the opinion of many others who are using Bitcoin, this is a wonderful use of energy. Bitcoin has the potential to have an incredibly strong impact on human rights across the world, the potential to liberate millions, potentially billions from financial tyranny. This is a very powerful use case, and it's worth the energy that we expend on it. Number 4, a lot of people within the crypto industry might contend that we could just shift from proof of work to proof of stake, and then we would do away with mining, and therefore we can reduce energy consumption. I think this is a misunderstanding. You've seen, a few of the points that I've made about mining itself and why it's not necessarily a waste of energy. But over and above that, this idea that proof of work and proof of stake are direct substitutes for each other is a misunderstanding. And I'm not here to bash Ethereum or to bash proof of stake, but there clearly are differences between these consensus mechanisms. And what we have seen since Ethereum's shift to proof of stake is that there has been greater centralization of the network. Most validators choose to validate through validation pools. That centralizes the custody of their assets and the execution of the consensus mechanism. And not only are those centralized amongst validator pools, but most of those validator pools are sitting in the US. So that vastly increases the centralization of the network and the risk of censorship of that network. Now, I'm not saying that's the death knell for Ethereum and that it's a failed project or anything like that, but this is a risk. And if we are talking about a future monetary system, a regime that can liberate many people from financial tyranny, we need to be mitigating against these risks. And centralization and censorship are incredibly important risks that are on the rise in the 2020s, as we've seen with the Canadian trucker protests in recent quarters. So the fifth and last reason, if we return to the primary question here of energy conservation, I think that it's potentially challenging to think that governments are going to solve this from sitting in the capital and deciding which industry they think is consuming too much energy, because what ends up happening is becomes quite political, and I think that is dangerous. But we do need to be asking ourselves the question, why are we consuming all of these resources? And for me, the answer is quite simple and right in front of our noses. Global interest rates are close to zero in some countries around the world. And what are central banks and fiscal authorities telling us when they lower interest rates? They're saying, go out and consume more cars, more houses, more holidays, more clothes, more food, more of everything, more of these scarce resources in the world today. Now, there's nothing wrong with consuming things, but if we're consuming scarce resources that we wouldn't otherwise have afforded, are we surprised that we damage the environment? I mean, it seems ridiculous to me to suggest otherwise. So for me, the solution to environmental damage is to contain debt-fueled consumption. And the way that we do that is by adopting a sound money that cannot easily be inflated in supply, like obviously the current one that we have, which can be inflated in supply, and hence why we have all this debt-fueled consumption. This is exactly the use case that Bitcoin is trying to solve. And it heightens the importance of making sure that it is sound, that it is decentralized, and that it is censorship resistant, so that we can go about solving some of the world's biggest challenges, including the conservation of energy. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the channel. And I also like to give a shout out to Nick Carter, because a lot of the research and the ideas here are come from his articles. So I really encourage you to check out his articles if you'd like to know more about Bitcoin mining, proof of work, proof of stake, and the energy industry. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video.